Megan always been a caring partner, or at least that's how she appeared. Sure, we had our ups and downs, like any marriage, but nothing that made me question our commitment. Or at least, I didn't think so. It all started on a regular Friday afternoon. I had just finished a project at work, and I decided to take the afternoon off. I hadn't planned anything for the weekend, and I was hoping to spend some time with Megan. So, I decided to surprise her. Maybe we could grab dinner, watch a movie, just enjoy each other's company. I pulled into the driveway and noticed that Megan's car was in the garage, so I knew she was home. I was in a good mood, excited to surprise her. But as I opened the door, I was met with a strange sight. Megan's phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, unlocked, and the screen was visible. At first, I didn't think much of it. She often leaves her phone lying around when she's in the middle of something. But then something caught my eye. The screen was on a text thread with her friend, Sarah. And not just any thread, a thread that seemed different from the usual, "Hey, how's your day?" exchanges I was used to seeing. This one was, well, it wasn't something I ever expected to read. The texts were recent, but as I looked closer, they weren't about dinner plans or weekend gossip. They were about Megan being so ready to see him again, and how she couldn't wait for tonight. I stared at the phone for a while, unsure of what I was seeing. My gut twisted in a way I had never experienced before. I thought maybe I was overreacting, but the more I read, the worse it got. It wasn't just a passing comment. It seemed like there was a pattern. I put the phone down quickly, hoping that maybe I had misinterpreted it, or that I was just being paranoid. But the seed had been planted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Megan came downstairs a few minutes later, smiling, asking if I wanted to grab dinner. I tried to keep my cool, but everything felt different. My mind was racing. I smiled back, but it wasn't genuine. There was a tension that had crept into the room that wasn't there before. "Sure, sounds great. You seem, in a good mood," I said, trying to sound casual. She smiled. "Yeah, I just had a great conversation with Sarah. We're planning a girls' night out next week." I nodded, but something inside me was screaming. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to her words than she was letting on. It wasn't just the text, there was something in her demeanor that felt off, as though she was hiding something. I couldn't shake the thought of that conversation, the words I had read flashing through my mind. I didn't ask her about the text messages then. I didn't confront her right away. I was still hoping it was nothing, still wondering if I had just misread the situation. But deep down, I knew that something had changed. I couldn't go back to being oblivious, not after what I had seen. I didn't know if I was ready to face the truth, but I couldn't just ignore it either. The next day, Megan had plans with her friends. She'd been going out with them a lot lately, something that hadn't struck me as unusual at first. But now, it was beginning to feel like she was avoiding being home. I knew I had to get to the bottom of this. I wasn't one to spy on my wife. I didn't believe in invading someone's privacy, especially not the person I was supposed to trust most in the world. But something about the way she had been acting, something about the way Sarah's name kept coming up, made me rethink that. I decided to take a more active approach. It wasn't until a few days later that everything came to a head. I was sitting at the kitchen table, having breakfast, when Sarah, Megan's friend, called. I didn't mean to overhear the conversation, but I couldn't help but hear Sarah's voice as she spoke loudly on the phone in the other room. Megan had gone out to run some errands, and I was alone. "Hey, so how's he doing? I bet you're looking forward to seeing him tonight." "I know you've been needing that," Sarah said, her voice carrying through the walls. I froze. I hadn't heard Megan's side of the conversation, but Sarah's words hit me like a freight train. It was like my worst fears had been confirmed. They were talking about someone. Someone Megan had been seeing behind my back. "Yeah, I can't wait. It's getting harder to hide it, but I'm not ready to tell him yet. I don't want him to leave. The blood drained from my face. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My wife, the woman I thought I knew, had been having an affair. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was real, and it was happening. I stayed there, frozen for what felt like hours, listening to the rest of the conversation. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I wanted to confront her, to confront both of them, but I knew I had to wait. I had to think this through. When Megan came back, I was sitting in the same spot, trying to gather my thoughts. She seemed totally unaware of what I knew. I stood up when I saw her enter, but I couldn't look at her. "Megan, we need to talk," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her face changed when she saw the look on my face. She probably knew something was wrong, but I didn't give her a chance to react. "I know what's been going on. I know about the affair." She froze, her face going pale. "David, please. Let me explain." I shook my head. "No more explanations. I've heard enough." This was just the beginning. I was no longer the oblivious husband who thought everything was fine. I had been lied to, and now, I needed to figure out what to do with the mess I found myself in. But before I could confront her further, there was still one thing on my mind. Who was this man? Where did he fit into all of this? I needed answers, and this was just the first step in getting them. The next few days felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Sarah's words echoed in my mind constantly. "I just hope David doesn't find out." "It's getting harder to hide it," they kept playing in my head on a loop, and the more I thought about it, the more it ate away at me. I couldn't stop myself from spiraling, the anger and hurt building up inside me with each passing minute. But I wasn't ready to confront Megan yet. I wasn't ready to face the truth. It felt like the pieces of my life were coming apart, and I couldn't handle the full weight of it all. So I decided to wait, just for a little while longer. On Saturday, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Megan had said she was going out to meet friends, but I couldn't shake the nagging thought that she was hiding something. After everything I had heard, I just couldn't trust her anymore. So, I decided to follow her. I didn't want to, and it didn't feel right, but I needed to know. I needed the truth. I couldn't sit idly by while the woman I loved was lying to me. I waited until she left the house, her car pulling out of the driveway. I followed her at a distance, my heart racing with every turn she made. She didn't go to the usual spots with her friends. Instead, I watched as she parked at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. I stopped a few blocks away and got out of the car, trying to remain unseen. My heart was pounding as I watched her walk up to the door of the cafe, smiling at someone standing outside. And that's when I saw him. The man. At first, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man was tall, wearing a black jacket, and he greeted Megan with a hug that was far too intimate for just a friendly meeting. As they pulled apart, I saw the way they looked at each other, like they had been waiting for this moment. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a simple moment of weakness. This was betrayal. Megan smiled at him, and then they walked into the cafe together, their hands brushing as they went inside. I stayed across the street, unable to move. My stomach twisted with disgust, with anger, with sorrow. I had always thought of Megan as someone who would never do something like this. But here I was, watching her with another man, seeing the truth that I had been avoiding for so long. I stayed there for what felt like hours, watching them. At one point, they sat at a table near the window, and I could see them laughing together, sharing an intimate conversation. They were close, too close. It was all too much to take in. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted, was now sitting with someone else, as if I had never existed. I wanted to go in there. I wanted to storm over to that table and confront her. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the sight in front of me. The disappointment was overwhelming. I had always tried to be understanding, to trust her, to support her no matter what. But this was something I couldn't just ignore. This wasn't a small betrayal. This was a whole life that she had been hiding from me. Eventually, Megan and the man got up from their table and left the cafe, walking down the street. I followed them from a distance, my heart racing with every step I took. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know where they were going. I had to know how far this had gone. They stopped at a nearby hotel. I watched from across the street as they entered together, and for the first time in my life, I felt utterly broken. I didn't need to see any more. The truth was clear now, and I couldn't pretend anymore. I turned and walked back to my car, my legs heavy, my mind numb. When I got home, everything felt different. I didn't know what to say to her. I didn't know what to do next. I just stood there, staring at the door, feeling like my entire life had come undone. Megan was still out, and I knew she wouldn't be back for a while. The silence in the house was deafening. When she finally returned, I was sitting on the couch, waiting. I didn't know how to say it, but I had to. I couldn't let her walk in here and act like everything was normal. I couldn't pretend everything was fine when I knew the truth. "Megan," I said, my voice quiet but firm. She looked up, a little surprised to see me sitting there. Her smile faltered as she stepped into the living room. "David, you're home early. I thought you'd be busy." "I know what's been going on," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "I saw you today. With him." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, there was a flicker of panic in her gaze. Then it quickly faded into something else, something that made my stomach twist even further. She took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure, but the damage had already been done. The truth was out, and there was no going back. "Megan, don't lie to me," I continued. "I watched you. I saw everything." She opened her mouth to say something, but I couldn't let her. I couldn't hear her excuses anymore. "I want the truth, Megan. Not the lies, not the, I was confused, speeches. I want to know why." Her face crumpled, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to make me feel sorry for her. I had already seen too much. I had already felt too much. "David, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear, I never wanted to hurt you. But I had already been hurt. The moment I saw her with him, I had felt it. The betrayal, the dishonesty, it was too much. I can't do this anymore, Megan," I said, my voice finally cracking. "I can't live this lie." I didn't know what the next steps were, or how I would move forward, but I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't stay in this relationship. The woman I had trusted, the woman I had loved, had betrayed me in a way that I couldn't even comprehend. I didn't know how to fix this. But I knew that I had to start taking care of myself. This was the end of the beginning. The real work was just about to start. It's been a few days since I confronted Megan. A few days since I saw her in the arms of another man, since I watched the life I thought I had crumble before my eyes. But as hard as those moments were, nothing could have prepared me for what came next. After I walked away from Megan, the house felt even emptier than it did before. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I knew the distance between us was unbridgeable now. I couldn't look at her without feeling that cold, hollow emptiness in my chest. She tried reaching out, of course. Apologies, explanations, begging for another chance. But the truth was, it didn't matter anymore. It felt like I had already lost her. What was left? The love? The trust? Gone, in an instant. But there was more that was weighing on me, more than just the mess Megan had created. I had been avoiding calls from my parents. The weight of everything going on with Megan had made me pull away from anyone who might ask too many questions. I didn't want to talk to anyone, least of all them. But this time, when my phone buzzed in the middle of the afternoon, I saw that it was my dad calling. I hadn't picked up his calls in over a week. I had been avoiding everyone, work, friends, even family. But something about the urgency in his voice when I finally answered changed everything. "David, it's your mom," he said, his voice shaky. "She's in the hospital. It's bad, son. The doctors don't think she's going to make it." I remember feeling like the ground fell out from under me when I heard those words. The heaviness of it hit me like a ton of bricks. I had just started to process the wreckage of my marriage, and now, my mom was in critical condition. It felt like the universe was throwing everything at me at once. There was no room to breathe, no room to process one thing before the next wave came crashing over me. "I'll be there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But inside, I was panicking. I had no idea what to do. My mom had always been the backbone of our family, and the thought of losing her sent waves of panic through me. My mind raced, and I felt like I was losing control of everything. I hung up the phone quickly, packed a bag, and rushed to the airport. The flight to my parents' house felt like the longest few hours of my life. I could barely focus, my mind filled with the images of Megan and the man I never wanted to picture again. The pain in my chest was still raw, but now it was compounded by the fear of losing my mom. When I arrived at the hospital, the air felt thick with tension. My dad was pacing in the waiting room, looking just as lost as I felt. When he saw me, his face softened for a moment, but the exhaustion in his eyes was clear. "She's in a coma, David," my dad said as soon as I walked in. "They're not sure if she'll make it through the night." I felt my stomach churn. I couldn't fathom the thought of losing her. My mom had always been the rock of our family, the person who kept everything together. But now, I was here, feeling helpless. I stood by her bedside, my heart breaking with each second that passed. It didn't help that I could feel my phone vibrating in my pocket. I knew it was Megan. She had been trying to reach me, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I couldn't deal with her right now. I couldn't even deal with myself. I felt like I was on the edge of breaking, and all I wanted to do was scream. The next few days were a blur. I spent most of my time at the hospital, barely sleeping, just sitting there by my mom's side, hoping for some sign of improvement. But there was nothing. The doctors kept saying the same thing: her condition was critical, and there was nothing more they could do. I hadn't spoken to Megan in days, and part of me was relieved. I couldn't handle her right now. The betrayal was still too fresh, the pain still too raw. But there was another part of me, one that was torn, one that wanted to talk to her, to hear her side of the story, to ask her why. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was drowning in my own grief, and I couldn't let her back in. Then, late one night, just as I was about to leave the hospital, I got a message from Megan. I didn't want to open it, but something inside me pushed me to. It read, "I don't know what to say anymore, David. I know I've hurt you. I've destroyed everything, but I'm so sorry. I want to fix things. I miss you." I stared at the message for a long time, my mind torn between wanting to believe her and wanting to shove her out of my life entirely. But I couldn't respond. I couldn't let myself fall back into the same cycle of doubt and pain. That night, as I sat alone in my hotel room, the weight of everything hit me all at once. My mom's condition, Megan's betrayal, the shattered pieces of my life. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and I didn't know if I had the strength to keep going. I wanted to collapse, to break down and let everything out, but I couldn't. I didn't know how to process any of this. The anger, the hurt, the overwhelming sense of loss, it was too much. In the days that followed, things didn't improve. My mom remained in a coma, and the uncertainty of her condition wore me down. I tried to focus on what was in front of me, but the thought of Megan, of what she had done to me, kept creeping in. I didn't know how to move forward. Everything was falling apart, and I didn't know how to fix it. When I got back to my parents' house after a few more days at the hospital, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same. The emotional weight of everything that had happened over the last week was suffocating. I'd been numb for a while, just going through the motions. The pain of my mom's condition was bad enough, but the betrayal from Megan had only added to the burden. It wasn't just the affair, it was the lies, the secrets, the way she had turned our life upside down without a second thought. I didn't even know who she was anymore. After a few sleepless nights in the hotel, I realized I couldn't go back to my old life in the city. I needed to be with my family for the time being. I needed space to breathe, to heal, and to figure out what my life would look like after all this. So, I made the decision to stay with my father for the foreseeable future. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only thing that made sense. My mom was still in critical condition, and I wanted to be close to her. I didn't want to be alone right now, and my father needed me just as much as I needed him. Living with my father was a bittersweet experience. There were moments when we sat together in the evenings, watching TV in silence, or talking about the good old days. But there was a constant undercurrent of tension. The house felt different now. There was a heaviness in the air, as though everything had changed, and no one quite knew how to adjust. My father tried his best to keep things light, but I could see the sadness in his eyes. But now, he was just as fragile as I felt. We didn't talk about everything, I think we both avoided it, but the fact that my mother was lying in a hospital bed, her life hanging by a thread, loomed over us constantly. Then came the message from Megan. It had been a few days since I last heard from her, and honestly, I wasn't sure I was ready to hear from her again. But she wasn't giving up. It was another long text, this time more desperate than before. It read, "David, please, I can't live with what I've done to you. I miss you more than you can imagine. Everything has fallen apart, and I don't know how to fix it. I never meant to hurt you. I know I've lost everything, but I'm begging you, please just let me explain." I stared at the message for a while, my fingers hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to reach out, to hear her out, to get some kind of closure, but another part of me was terrified. I wasn't sure if I could hear any more lies. I wasn't sure if I could let myself fall back into her web of manipulation. Finally, I typed back. "I don't think you understand how much damage you've done, Megan. I can't be the person you want me to be. I don't know what you want from me, but I can't give you another chance. You've hurt me too much. I'm done." The next few days felt like a blur. I stayed with my father, keeping busy with small things around the house, trying to distract myself from the storm of emotions inside. But even as I tried to focus on my mom, on the possibility of losing her, the situation with Megan continued to eat at me. She wasn't just a distant memory now, she was still trying to claw her way back into my life, even though I had made it clear that I couldn't forgive her. And it wasn't just me who had been affected by her betrayal. Megan was beginning to lose everything she had built. Word had gotten out about the affair, her friends, the people at work, even some of her family, started distancing themselves from her. The fallout from her actions was beginning to settle in. A few days later, I heard from one of our mutual friends, and what they told me shook me. Megan had been let go from her job. I didn't know the full story, but apparently, her employer had gotten wind of the affair. She wasn't just losing the respect of the people she had once considered friends, she was losing her career as well. The company had done a quick investigation after a few complaints from colleagues, and they'd made the decision to fire her. It wasn't exactly a victory for me, but there was a small part of me that felt a sense of justice. Megan had everything, her career, our life together, and she had thrown it all away for a brief, selfish affair. Now, she was left with nothing. As the weeks passed, I continued to stay with my father, trying to make the best of the situation. My mother's health remained unchanged, still critical, but she was holding on. Megan tried reaching out a few more times, but each time, I shut her down. I wasn't interested in hearing more excuses, more lies. But there were moments when I thought about her. I thought about the life we had shared, the love we had once had, and how easily it had all been torn apart. I wondered if she was truly sorry, or if she just felt the sting of consequences. At some point, I realized that I wasn't angry at her anymore. I wasn't angry at the affair, or at the lies, or at the way she had destroyed everything. I was angry at myself. I had allowed it to happen. I had ignored the signs, trusted her without question, and when the truth came out, it was like everything I had worked for had just been ripped away. The thing that hit me hardest was that, despite everything, I still felt some attachment to her. Not love, not anymore, but a part of me still wished things had turned out differently. I didn't want to feel this way, I didn't want to care, but I still did. It was the hardest thing to admit to myself, that after everything, I was still struggling to let go. But I knew I had to. I'm slowly finding peace. Things with my father are improving. He's still grieving, but we've started talking more, sharing memories of my mom. It's been a painful road, but I can't let the past hold me hostage anymore. Megan's world is falling apart, and as much as I'm tempted to feel sorry for her, I know it's her doing. I'm working on rebuilding my life. One step at a time. My relationship with Megan may never be repaired, but at least I know I'm moving forward. Even if it's hard, even if I'm still hurting, I'm starting to heal. It's just going to take time. I was still staying with my father, who had become my rock in these turbulent times. The grief over my mom's health had settled into something more manageable, but it still hung over us. She was holding on, but the doctors had told us not to expect any miracles. My father and I had settled into a routine, the occasional dinner together, hours of silence, and small talks about things like work, or the weather, or any topic that allowed us to stay numb for a while. One cold afternoon, I decided to take a walk. The winter air bit at my face, and I welcomed the sting, hoping it would shake me from my usual fog. I wasn't sure where I was headed, but I knew I needed to get out of the house. I needed to feel like I was moving forward, even if I wasn't quite sure where that would lead me. As I turned down a street near the park, I spotted someone standing at the bus stop. He looked vaguely familiar, but it wasn't until I stepped closer that I realized who it was. John. I called out, the name escaping my lips before I could stop it. John Taylor. It had been years since I'd seen him. We had grown up together, best friends throughout high school and part of college before we drifted apart. Life had taken him one direction, and I had gone another. But I remembered him as someone who could always make me laugh, someone who seemed to know how to handle life no matter what it threw at him. David, he said, his face lighting up when he saw me. Man, I can't believe it's you. It's been forever. I couldn't help but smile at the sight of him. Seeing an old friend, someone from a time before all the mess in my life, felt like a breath of fresh air. We hugged briefly, and I felt a wave of nostalgia wash over me. What are you doing here? I asked, trying to ignore the emptiness that had become so familiar. You still in town? Yeah, I just moved back actually. Things didn't work out where I was living, so I decided to return and start fresh. He shrugged. You know how it is. Anyway, what about you? You look like you've been through hell, man. What happened? I hesitated. The weight of everything I had been through lately pressed down on me, but I decided to answer honestly. Maybe this was what I needed, the chance to talk to someone who hadn't been involved in all the drama. Someone who could offer a different perspective. It's a long story, John, I said, my voice softer than I intended. My mom's sick. My marriage fell apart. And I'm just trying to figure things out. John's face softened, and he nodded sympathetically. Man, I'm sorry to hear that. That sounds like a lot. But I get it. Life hits you hard sometimes, and you just gotta roll with it, right? But hey, you don't have to go through it alone. You've got me now. We decided to grab a coffee, and as we sat in the small cafe down the street, we caught up on each other's lives. John told me about his job back in the city, his failed relationships, and how he was still trying to get his footing. He didn't sugarcoat anything, and it was easy to see that he had been through his own share of struggles. But it wasn't just about the past. As the conversation shifted to me, I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't expected. I told him about Megan, how I had trusted her completely, how I had believed we were building a future together, only for it all to come crashing down. I told him about the betrayal, about how I had found out through the worst way possible. And then I said something I hadn't admitted to anyone yet: I don't even know who I am anymore, John. She changed everything. I don't even recognize myself sometimes. John listened patiently, never interrupting. When I finished, he gave me a look that I hadn't expected. It wasn't sympathy, it wasn't pity. It was understanding. David, he said quietly, I don't know the whole story, but I do know this: you can't let her take that from you. You can't let her change who you are. You're more than just a guy who got cheated on. You're a guy who's been through hell and came out the other side. That's something to be proud of. When I left the cafe, I felt lighter. Not by much, but enough to make a difference. I wasn't carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders anymore, and for the first time in a long time, I was looking ahead, not back. That night, I went home to my father's house, feeling a shift in my perspective. Megan had already been through her consequences, and though I couldn't forgive her yet, or maybe ever, I knew I needed to let go of my anger. I didn't need to keep living in her shadow. I didn't need to keep defining myself by what had happened.